Urban sketching is a thing that many artists would like to do, but they might feel like it's too complicated. You gotta think too much about perspective lines and the horizon line and all that stuff. And I'm gonna show you how I often approach an urban sketch that will hopefully help you get over that hesitation. And my name is Brian. I'm here weekly sharing art and whatnot, and today, urban sketching. Mostly focusing on the architecture. The other week, I was doing a sketch from a reference photo, and when we look at this to start with, man, it could be overwhelming. So many lines and all the windows, the details. But I think that we can get a good result by simplifying the shapes, blocking in shadows, and creating the illusion of detail. This particular reference I thought was good because I think it'll be pretty clear how we can do these things. And then we can also explore different levels of detail and attention to exactness. I'll typically begin by observing the silhouette of the scene, the major shapes, ignore the bits and the bobs and the little details. Just look at the major blocks and the overall outline and structure. Notice that I'm just approximating the location of the lines based on what I see, just the basic lines. I'm not going to get bogged down with all the windows and the frills, at least not at this point. And once the basics are established, like they are here, well, then maybe we can go to the next level of detail. In this case, maybe marking where the individual buildings are. There's a little bit of foliage here that I'm marking. We could also add in some of the roof line and a few of the details, maybe the dormers and locations of doors and windows. But you can see that I'm being really rough. I'm just basically establishing where things are, but I'm not committing 100% to anything right now. Of course, I'm using pen just so that you can see what I'm doing. A pencil might be hard to see on video, but the idea is to really only get detailed after you have established the basic parts. Now, this is super basic. Nothing is measured or perfect, but you can clearly see that this is an urban scene, even already. And I'll talk about details as we go through some more refined sketches. But you'll notice I haven't drawn a horizon line, no perspective lines. If you're observant with the basic shapes, you may not need to think about that stuff much or at all. Now, knowing how perspective works will absolutely help you. I'm not trying to discourage you from learning that. But perspective lines in a scene like this, where the street is curved, and perspective lines would be different for each building, and for a sketch like this, I'd say it's overkill. Now, this particular reference is great also because the lighting is obvious and it's directional, and you can bring the scene to life with just some pretty simple shading techniques. There's a very strong shadow going across the street, which we can mark, and it looks like the buildings on the right side of the street are getting sun as well, other than the one building that's closest to us. And everything else gets really no direct light, and that will all be in shadow. And we're going to ignore stuff like ambient light and bounce light and all that stuff. We're staying simple. So in just a few minutes, really, we have really gotten to the meat of this scene on paper. It's a very, very simple sketch, but it's recognizable and it has depth and form. You could almost pass this off as being done. Now, if it were me, I'd practice this sort of loose urban sketching, never getting into the fine details until you feel comfortable with this sort of idea. And incidentally, this is very similar to how I do portraits. Simple shapes, ignore the details, block in the shadows, and refine and refine. And that's basically it. Now I'm going to do a couple sketches, and the main differences are going to be in the attention to detail. Typically when we say attention to detail, it's a good thing, and very often it is, but I'm also going to propose that sometimes less is more. You can see that I blocked in the basic shapes like we talked about with, you can see that's the orange pencil there. And I'm going to just jump right in with a fine liner. In this first sketch, I'm going to be fairly careful with my lines. Not being exact copies of the reference, but, somewhat close. For me, I'm more interested in capturing the feel of a scene than like an exact engineering drawing. But on this one, I'm going to be mindful of the spacing of things and doing that proportionally, and making my lines make good sense as if I were following a bunch of perspective lines, which I'm not. And one thing that you will see develop is the illusion of detail. I'm not going to be adding individual bricks or shingles, but I might add occasional details like, individual window panes, a few individual leaves on the vines, a trash can or two. And often that is more than enough to make this look more detailed than it actually is. And we'll go further with this in the next sketches, so we can do some comparison. Comparison? We can do some comparisons. How about comparisinating? I think that was the word I wasn't looking for. Anyway, I'm using some watercolor here to finish the sketch off, being mindful of what is in light and what is in shadow. But as you'll see, I'm also giving some attention to detail on the color selections. And then I'll kind of give the lighted areas a wash of yellow, and the shadow areas a wash of purples and blues. And overall, this is a fairly basic sketch. Not a ton of details, but enough that it is fairly accurate as a representation of the scene. But honestly, to me, it's a little bit boring. It looks like a drawing that was copied from a photograph, and it was. It's not bad, but I don't think it has a lot of life to it. So let's loosen up a little bit more. Now, in this sketch, I decided to look less at the reference photo and just work more on getting more of a feel. Now, these lines that I'm drawing are ugly, not architectural at all. They're curvy, misshapen, not in the right place often. I'm almost doing a single line contour drawing here. And I'm actually working so loosely that I'm blocking in my major shapes and adding middle level detail in the same step. And well, this is partially because I've sketched this scene about a half a dozen times already, so I kind of know the layout, but yeah, accurate detail is not my focus. And even with this low level of detail, this almost looks more complex than that first sketch. Sometimes if you get a few of the important things right and kind of scribble in some other stuff, even if it's not actually correct, you can add a lot of meat to the sketch. And in a way, it even becomes more dynamic. And there's a reason that architectural presentations in the concept phase are often very loose. For one, the details aren't known, of course, but also that it has more emotional pull. That's not an accident. When cities are proposing a new building to the public, they rarely have an engineering drawing because those are boring. They have one that is full of people and trees and washes of color because an observer won't always remember the details of a building, but they will remember the feeling. So just something that we can incorporate into our art as well. Is one approach better than the other? Nope, just different intentions. And this is just one way to look at it. and we can go further still. you, you want some ugly lines? You're going to get some ugly lines. There is barely a correct detail in this sketch that I'm doing here. The basic shapes and the silhouette are more or less correct, but the details, I mean, I think I end up removing a couple buildings altogether and added in stuff that isn't there in the reference photo, but you know, it just felt right. But no problem. Often on these types of sketches, I will intentionally distort proportions and perspective just because it's more interesting. It's almost like making a caricature of a city block when you do that kind of thing. I didn't go quite that far with this one, as I was more interested in exploring the necessity of accurate detail, or perhaps the lack of necessity. You can decide when we get to compare everything at the end. And on this sketch, I went super bold with the colors, really let the stuff in the shadow wallow in the blues. I've splattered some paint and added some protrusions from the buildings to add some action, and I went a little bit further with the ivy too. I will say that because of my lack of attention, I made the lit buildings on the right appear closer than they should be. You know, they really should be a little bit further back, but you know, that's one of the risks of doing a don't think, just draw sort of method. Still, I like it. You know, it feels alive, it's got some character, and although it's not an accurate representation exactly, I think it does still capture the right kind of feel. I think that each of these sketches has merit. The first one is probably the most accurate overall, and the second one, a little bit more playful. I really like the sky on this one in particular. And the third one is probably the most dramatic, but maybe pushing it in the accuracy department. I don't know, which one do you prefer? I'd love to know if you could write me a message in the comments. Have you done some urban sketching yourself? You know, it's a lot more fun if you can actually be outside and do it in person. I really highly suggest it. And thank you for joining me today. Like and subscribe if you found this video helpful or inspiring, and I'll get working on something new for next week. Until then, bye-bye.